if you're not trying to understand the society you're trying to change, you're not serious about change.
It's not enough to be right. We also need to be effective somehow.
Hey everyone, I'm Sally Abed.
And I'm Jess Bricker.
And this is The Long Answer,
a deep dive into the hardest questions around Israel-Palestine. Hi everyone, welcome back to The Long Answer. Today we are going to be talking about Israeli society and where Israeli society is at in this moment, where it's been at for the past couple years. And we're going to be joined by Eran Halperin, who is a professor of social psychology. And he's a super smart dude. And he's going to help us make sense of what is going through the heads of the average person in our society.
Eran is also one of the founders of aChord, social psychology for social change. He polls Israeli society constantly, both Jewish and Palestinian, within Israel. And we will be talking also about some of his findings and processes that he thinks are conductive of social change.
The reason why we wanted to have an episode about Israeli society and understanding the psychology behind people in the society is because so much of our work, when we're trying to organize and mobilize people, requires understanding where people are at, meeting people where they're at, and moving forward with that. And so we want to make it clear that we're not aiming to justify or excuse or exceptionalize Israeli society in any way, but we are aiming to understand it, and we're aiming to give that understanding to you as well, so that you can understand what we need to do in our society in order to reach a different place and in order to move forward. And after we speak to Eran, me and Sally are going to keep chatting and reflecting on the things that we heard from him. With that, let's move on to our interview with Eran.
I'm really happy to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Very excited to have you here. Would you mind introducing yourself?
I'm a professor of social and political psychology at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. I'm also the head of the psychology department at the Hebrew University and the head and founder of aChord Center, aChord Social Psychology for Social Change.
So, Eran, the reason that we invited you is because, looking at the polls about Israeli society, it doesn't look very good. I'm being nice. The normalization of a siege, of military occupation, incarceration, even torture, killing children, starvation. We are really looking some kind of normalized discourse around these things, which is scary. But we're also seeing normalized discourse about the deterioration of democratic institutions. And we wanted to ask you, is the Israeli society exceptionally racist or undemocratic?
Wow. You want the short answer or the long answer?
Guess what's the name of this podcast?
Before I'll say anything else, I want to say that the fact that I'm able to look at what's happening to the Israeli society from a social psychological perspective and explain these processes doesn't mean that I accept them. And I'm saying it especially because many of the things that I'm going to say right now can be sound as if I'm legitimizing or normalizing these processes, and I'm not. In your opening words, you've mentioned that we're doing whatever we can to change the situation, not just to understand it. We're trying to map the situation in order to identify areas in which we can actually create change. So what I'm going to do right now is to try and explain what we see when we look at the Israeli society, mainly the Jewish society. Let's not say Israeli society, because then I think that we're confusing our listeners, but I don't mean to normalize it. So first of all, I would say I absolutely agree with you. What we see in our data is scary. I mean, huge increase in levels of racism, hatred, dehumanization, very, very, very low levels of empathy towards the suffering of people who are, definitely innocent civilians, both in Gaza and looking at the Palestinians more broadly. And very, very high level of in-group glorification, we can call it, or, levels of, I would say, blind patriotism. And I would also say that's what you would expect in many ways from a society that went through what the Israeli society went through at October 7th. Again, I don't mean to say that it's fine and it's okay and that I justify it, but when you look at the literature on societies in conflict, if I had seen something different among Jews in Israel after October 7th, I would be shocked. It's a different conversation about why didn't we see at least an incremental decrease in these very extreme attitudes and emotions throughout the time. But at least when it comes to what happened immediately after October 7th, what we saw is what we expected to see. And maybe I'll try to explain it in simple ways. At least on the days after October 7th, when there was still a concern that, enemies of Israel from all around the area would join Hamas, many Israelis really felt that maybe we're not going to survive as a nation, as a country, as a state. I remember I got a call from a professor, a friend of mine, who asked me, Eran, what are the chances that in a week from now, there's not going to be Israel? Not going to be Israel at all. And again, many of us who have better knowledge about this conflict can look at it and say, hey, that's not realistic. There wasn't really an existence, but that's not relevant. In the psychology of most Jews in Israel, that's what happened. And when people feel that their actual individual and collective existence is under threat, there are some psychological mechanisms that come into play. There's a conservative shift. People go to the right of the political map in terms of their values and ideologies. They're basically saying, we need to come together. Like in Israel, it was together we will win, ביחד ננצח. We need to create a very, very clear line between the people who are with us and the people who are against us. There's nothing like a gray area between these.
No space for nuance. I remember that.
Either part of my group or you are my enemy, okay?
Yeah.
In these cases, there is no room for a more complex or nuanced thinking. One of the implications of that is that all out-group, they're the same. There's no difference between Hamas, Palestinians in the West Bank, Arabs or Palestinians in Israel. Everyone are the same because they're part of the same group. Again, it's not necessarily because Israelis or Jewish Israelis are, bad people or immoral people. It's because in these kind of situations of high threat, we oversimplify the reality because we simply cannot take risks.
We did establish that it is almost globally expected. It's something that is among all collectives who would endure that would react like this. However, we are 2 years into October 7th attack.
Okay, so everything that I've described up until now, as you said, is it's almost the generic reaction of societies to such situations. I want to add 3 more aspects that I would say that are more specific to this case, aspects that are related to some extent to the occupation, but would make the Israeli case in that sense more unique, I would say. The first one is something that we don't talk about much, but I think that is very, very relevant to that situation. And that is I would call it even the sense of humiliation that led to a huge urge for revenge among many Jews in Israel. One of the unique aspects of what happened in October 7th is, it's basically a surprise, but it's much more than a surprise because there's clearly asymmetrical power relations between the Israel and Palestinians in Gaza and in the West Bank. And when you have such asymmetrical power relations, also the high power side has some views about itself and the self-image and how Jewish Israelis see themselves. And suddenly Hamas came on October 7th and challenged everything. Challenged everything in terms of, how advantaged we are as Israelis, how powerful the IDF is, how smart we are, how sophisticated we are. Hamas didn't just surprise Israel. It also portrayed Israel and Israelis in a light that we didn't see themselves as such before, but also in front of the entire world. And that sense of humiliation, and I would even say loss of control, loss of the sense of agency, motivated many Israelis to search for what I would even say revenge. I would even say revenge. And when we talk about revenge, it's going beyond the create some kind of deterrence, like teach them a lesson, you can say, but even going more than that. And we saw, when we looked at the videos coming out of Gaza, like taken by Israeli soldiers and making them proud, oftentimes in immoral actions that were conducted, basically to say, we're
reminding you who's
the stronger side.
Yeah.
We teach you a lesson. You will never get back to this. So I think that's part of the consequences of, or the result of this sense of humiliation and also motivation for revenge. The second thing that I think that we underestimate, or many of us underestimate, was a huge frustration by the fact that Israel, such a powerful nation for almost 2 years, cannot bring back the hostages from Gaza and cannot bring Hamas in Gaza to surrender in any way. I remember conversations that I had with some, mainstream Israeli friends that after October 7th said something like, I won't believe that it will take more than 3 weeks for Israel to win Hamas. And then for almost 2 years, Hamas still keeps the hostages. And that created huge frustration among Israelis that basically led to the point in which Israelis said, do whatever it takes, whatever it needs in order to win this battle. And the last thing that I would say, throughout these 2 years, one argument that we've heard from many Israelis in our studies was something like, Hamas can end it tomorrow morning. They can end it tomorrow morning. They can release the hostages and basically say that they give up their weapon, and they can end it tomorrow morning. And as long as they don't do that, we have the moral justification to do whatever we can. And I think that humiliation, frustration, and the belief that at the end of the day, Hamas has the power to simply end everything, freed many Israelis to basically said, we can do whatever we want as long as they don't end this situation. And that goes beyond the more
Would you describe this as moral dissonance? Do you think the Israeli public is facing some kind of moral, cognitive dissonance, or is it really freed from it, from the guilt?
I'll be very, very, very honest. I think that the things that I've seen, or that we've seen in terms of our data when it comes to questions about morality, guilt, empathy, the mainstream of the Israeli society radicalized in its attitudes towards the Palestinians in a way that I've never seen. Levels of dehumanization became almost a consensus among many Israelis, and in that sense, it was very, very difficult for me to actually identify this dissonance that you've just mentioned. I didn't see. Dissonance is a tension between two different values or two different attitudes, or between a certain value and a certain behavior. I think that the one thing that helped in quote unquote most Israelis to avoid this dissonance was the issue of hostages. I think that the issue of the hostages really prevented Israelis from even experiencing a dissonance. I think that under any other circumstances, at least the mainstream of the Israeli society would experience some level of dissonance between what they or what we believe that are our democratic human values on the one hand, and the behavior or the actions of Israel and the IDF on the other hand. I think that as long as the hostages were kept in Gaza, most Israelis didn't even experience such dissonance.
In that regard, do we think that now that there is some sort of ceasefire or there is some sort of change, Jewish Israeli society will be in a position where they're able to grapple with things, not just from the perspective of solutions and what we need going forward, but also what we've done as a society? Or is Israeli society possibly less able to deal with that now because, the hostages are back and they can ignore that? Like, will there be some sort of reckoning with what has happened as part of moving towards a solution?
So first of all, I would say that, it's very, very difficult for people generally to look at the mirror and see an ugly face. I'm saying it not as a criticism. I'm saying it as something that we need to acknowledge. I mean, the expectation that, any society in the world would, happily look at the mirror and say, what terrible people we are, is almost unrealistic. And again, it's not a binary kind of situation. It's not 0 or 100. And I think that the question should be, should we expect to see more and more Israelis taking responsibility for some of the atrocities that happened in Gaza during these 2 years? And more Israelis recognizing the suffering of the Palestinians in Gaza, feeling empathy, and also willing to compensate and maybe do some more practical thing? I think that the answer is yes. I think that when threat decreases, and threat in that sense is both the realistic and the tangible threat, but also the symbolic threat of boycott and other things, then people oftentimes are more willing to look at the mirror, to take responsibility, to experience guilt, and also to compensate for their wrongdoings. I would say, and again, we know it from many of our studies, that even in that case, there's a smart ways to do it that would be more sophisticated or effective, and ways to do it that would be less sophisticated or effective. Our social identity, our identification with our group, is part of who we are. And basically saying my group is immoral or my group is a terrible group is basically saying I'm a terrible person. And no one in the world, or most people, cannot say I'm a terrible person. And when we look at the history of most conflicts, violent conflicts also include some phases of terrible atrocities, mass killing, etc. Usually societies are able to take responsibility for the wrongdoing and atrocities, mostly when they're convinced that these things do not reflect on who they are as a society. And there's a very delicate tension here. How do you do that? How do you make Israelis, for example, accept responsibility for the wrongdoings and the terrible things in Gaza without saying we're terrible human beings or terrible society? I want to add one more thing, and this relates to a bigger picture perspective that should be presented here as well. And that's the fact that basically when you look definitely at the political system, when you look at the political leaders in Israel, the conflict between Israel and the Palestinians wasn't really part of the public discourse in Israel for so many years. Israel adopted this terrible narrative of what we call conflict management, or managing the conflict, or minimizing the conflict, like nihul hasichsuch or tzimtzum hasichsuch. And the idea was, there's a terrible conflict in this area. It cannot be resolved for many reasons. Most Israelis believe that it's the Palestinian side who should be blamed for the fact that it cannot happen. And we did our best, or we've been doing our best to make Palestinians' life okay. And given that the mainstream or even most center-left parties in Israel didn't talk neither about the conflict itself, nor about the occupation, or about, racism and inequality, then there wasn't anyone, or I don't want to say anyone because you're part of an organization that was there, but I mean anyone that can actually speak to the mainstream Israelis that actually introduced a counter-normative argument. So if you look at the mainstream public discourse in Israel during the war, the disagreements were mainly about ending the war to bring back the hostages. It's not ending the war because terrible things are happening in Gaza and we need to stop the killing of innocent civilians in Gaza. So there wasn't a real discussion, and I'm talking about the mainstream of the political or social leadership in Israel between these two things. And I think that the main reason for that was the issue of the hostages on the one hand, and the fact that there wasn't any psychological, normative, political infrastructure in Israel to create such debate.
Exactly. I feel just what we have really struggled to do in the movement, and we really try to do it, is to tell people Hiskimim mitzilim chayim, deals are what save lives, and not, military intervention again and again and again. That's the knee-jerk reaction of Israel for decades, especially against Palestinians, but really against everyone. That's exactly the lack of alternative. Just before, last month, I think 2 months ago, I was with my baby in a protest in Haifa, and I was holding a sign that says, a child is a child, yeled ze yeled. And I got shouted at while holding my own Palestinian baby. It was extremely isolating. Even the mothers, just women who shouted at me, whose children are probably in active duty in Gaza or in the West Bank or, wherever. They just don't understand how they could not send their children to Gaza. And I think that's also part of the lack of alternative. What I'm trying to get at is not just that people are not talking about Palestinians as humans or about Palestinian statehood or peace as a way of security. There's no one talking about the option that we don't have to have military interventions and kill people and bomb people. And that is exceptional circumstance. I think that is something that is a product of the occupation, of decades of military control.
As someone who's trying to create change, I would say one thing that Israelis definitely understand right now is that military force can only take you thus far. It won't take you, beyond a certain point. That's very clear. Israel, used its entire force, and Hamas is still in Gaza, and the hostages came back only because Trump forced Netanyahu to go for a deal, and it's very clear. But they didn't go, one step further to actually say, okay, so what can really bring us security? And for me, we can look at this situation and say, it's so terrible. But I can also look at myself and say, that's part of my failure. At the end of the day, I can understand why most Israelis after October 7th care mostly about their sense of security. As a psychologist, I would say that's not surprising. That's what human beings do, do when they experience something so dramatic as October 7th. And then I ask myself, okay, what can I do about that? And what you've just said, which was true, that most Israelis don't associate in any way the peaceful resolution of that conflict with security. For them, peaceful resolution of that conflict and the end of occupation is a security threat and not a security solution. And I want to say that that's our failure. The fact that we're not managing to somehow communicate the fact that diplomatic arrangements and peaceful arrangements are the only way to achieve security solution. I don't like us taking this victim position, saying it's so terrible, they become radical, we're doing something wrong.
It's more about taking responsibility over our own society. Absolutely.
It's not enough to be right. We also need to be effective somehow. And the question of how can we be effective in mobilizing public opinion is what I always think about and trying to be better at. And, one thing, if we want to highlight one positive thing, is that two things happen when you look at public opinion in Israel. Two things happened at the same time after October 7th. One is what we've talked about up until now, is, dehumanization, hatred, increased like racism, even the belief that, peace is impossible, there is no Palestinian partner to talk to. Everything is there. We know that it's there. But at the same time, another thing that happened really, really quickly is that many Israelis, like the mainstream of the Jewish Israeli society, also came to the understanding that we need to do something different, that it's much more urgent to resolve the conflict than what we thought about before October 7th, that military force cannot really bring security if it is not accompanied by diplomatic arrangements. And I would say, when we look at our data, most Israelis right now, or the mainstream Israeli society, is ready, or there's at least a potential there to introduce new ideas, creative ideas.
What kind of interventions do we need? In what direction are we going right now?
We need to create processes. I don't even want to call them interventions. We need to create processes that are tailored to the psychological mindset of, both the Jewish and the Palestinian society
in Israel.
I'll just give you a small example from the studies that we do. When we ask Israelis these days, to what extent would you support a peace agreement based on two-state solution? That's a question that we've been asking for a very long time. We get the lowest numbers ever of support for this idea. I would say between 25 to 30% support within the general society in Israel, like Jews and Palestinians all together. These are the lowest numbers ever. Okay? Why? Because when we talk to the people that are answering these questions and we ask them, what does it mean for you to support this idea? They're saying it's basically making compromises with the people who tried to kill me. We're just giving them gift or present and showing them that it makes sense to try and destroy Israel. But when we ask the same question, but just differently, we ask, to what extent would you support a security regional, agreement led by the US, supported by moderate Arab countries like Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and Jordan, that includes a Palestinian state? We get the support of about 60% of the Israelis. 60%. Like almost 2/3 of the Israelis basically support peace agreement based on the two-state solution if it is framed properly. Now, of course, most of us would like to frame it in the way that I framed it in the first option. Okay? Peace based on two-state solution, that's the values that we want to promote, that's the way we want to talk about it. But this is considered by most Israelis just as a compromise, and there's no reason, according to their mindset, to make compromises right now. But if you frame the same thing differently, as a security deal, something that can help them to feel more secured in terms of their daily life, and also not as a bilateral kind of agreement, but something that includes many other countries and can, incentivize Israel in many ways, then there are 40% or 35 to 40% of Israelis who oppose the same thing and now support it. So there's a tension here, that's what I'm trying to say, between being right and being effective. I'm not suggesting that we always need to be effective. Not always. Sometimes it's important to say very, very clearly who we are and who we want to be, even if it's not effective. But what I'm trying to convey here is the message that we always need to consider these two things between, being right, being effective. Again, ideally, I would want to be both right and effective. But sometimes there's tension between the two.
I'm thinking about two kind of major feedback that the Israeli society is getting about this. One is the pro-Palestinian movement internationally. They are isolating the Israeli society. You are terrible. I would love for you to comment on that. And how is that influencing the Israeli society? Boycott, divestment, and sanctions, but also just, very heavily criticizing the Israeli society as irredeemable, as immoral, and condoning, the occupation and the oppression of Palestinians for decades. But the other potential feedback that Israelis can be getting from Palestinians is from Palestinians in Israel. And on the second one, I feel like that's part of my theory of change. As a Palestinian, I am very vocally Palestinian. And people are always like, oh, why do you want to be provocative? I'm like, no, I'm not trying to be provocative. I'm just trying to be, Palestinian while also taking responsibility over your future and your prosperity and your welfare and your security as an Israeli, as part of Israeli society. What kind of feedback are Israelis getting from abroad, from outside, but also from their own society that can be conductive or destructive of, I guess, de-escalating that sense of threat?
For me, we can even combine these two aspects that you mentioned here. And I want to say something general, and then we can think about it in the context of the two areas that you've just mentioned. There's interesting work in social psychology that was conducted by a former student of mine, now Professor Eric Schumann, who asked, what kind of pressure or what kind of protest can actually change policy or change people's views, and especially people who are holding the power in their hands? And in that sense, I think that it's relevant both to the pressure coming towards Israel from outside, from the pro-Palestinian movement, or from other countries outside of Israel, but also from Palestinians from within Israel. And what Eric found in his really fascinating studies is that pressure is effective in actually changing policies, or I can say differently, pressure is effective in leading high power people to give up their power when it is perceived or communicated as what he calls as constructive disruption. Constructive disruption. And what he's basically saying, and I think that you'll very quickly understand how is it relevant to what you've said, is that the pressure should be disruptive. Disruptive, like creating pressure that's basically, conveying a message saying you won't be able to function if you would not address our demands on the one hand. So it has to be destructive. It has to be, to some extent, aggressive, I would say. But on the other hand, it should also be constructive. Constructive meaning to say, but we're putting this pressure on you, this disruptive pressure, not because we want to destroy you, but because we want to improve you or what you're doing. That's very, very relevant when you think, for example, on the pro-Palestinian movement or the pressure coming from outside of Israel by other countries on the Israeli society. Because when this pressure is perceived as, these people are trying to destroy the state of Israel, then the response would be aggressive. But when this pressure is perceived as, they're really threatening us, but they're doing it because they care about us. So I'm thanking Sally what you said before. What I'm doing here, I'm doing it as a Palestinian, but as a Palestinian Israeli, because I care about the Israeli society more broadly. And I'm putting this pressure because I want to improve Israel. I want to improve the situation of Palestinians, promote equality, of course, and everything, but because I want the Israeli society to be better. That sounds more like constructive disruption. And I will say that oftentimes these kind of situations fail in doing it. They fail in doing it because they go too much towards the disruptive side without emphasizing the constructive aspect, or too much to the constructive aspect, but then they're not being disruptive enough to have the potential to create change. And I would say it's challenging. I mean, it's not easy to identify the sweet spot of finding the right spot between being constructive and being disruptive at the same time.
It is challenging and it is a balance. And I think as a movement, we're always trying to find that sweet spot. Always, constantly. Sometimes we hit it, sometimes we miss it.
Yeah, and in a way, we've already talked about two different tensions. Like one is between being right and being effective, and the other one is between being disruptive, but also being perceived as constructive. And I think that that's the area in which we should search for the most effective ways to mobilize people and change societies.
I know you're sensitive on time. One last thing that you want us to take from this, like as movements, as listeners abroad, one thing that you want us to take.
Yeah, I think that I felt that our conversation went, I don't want to say too much, but a lot towards the negative side. There are also some very positive, or not very, but some positive indications for things that are happening here in the last 3 years, I would say. One is there is a rise or an increase in Israel in, I would say, democratic identity of many people. And again, it's not at the point in which I wish it would have been, but it's much, much, much better than where we were like 3 or 4 years ago. And I think that there's an increase in people's understanding that there's much more in common to Jews and Palestinians in Israel who hold democratic values than Jews who do not hold democratic values. And I think that's quite a meaningful change that happened in Israel. I think that the fact that many more Israelis in the last 3 years see themselves as, as activists and go out to the streets almost every week. Again, not always for the best reasons, not always saying the things that we would have wanted them to say, but the fact that, the dedication is a much more common phenomenon in Israel right now than it has been, years before, is also something positive to highlight. And the last thing, again, so many bad things happened here in the last 2 years, so many terrible things happened, but I think that the realization of many Israelis that power cannot solve everything, and that, we will not be able to protect ourselves just by using force. We need to think more creatively, more openly, differently on political and diplomatic solutions because, unfortunately, not because we, care about the other, but because that's the only way to feel secured in this country. Again, it's a positive sign, and it's something we can use to try and also, mobilize people towards the values and the beliefs that we think that can actually promote change that is so needed here in our area.
Amen.
Wow, thank you so much, Eran. I think you really brought us a lot of food for thought.
We will continue conversation. Thank you so much for everything that you do and for being with us today.
Thank you.
Bye. Wow, I thought that he shone a light on such important things, and it was so interesting for me that I forgot to ask questions. So thank you, Sally, for...
Yeah, I was looking at you. I knew you were just listening to a very interesting...
Yeah, I was just interesting. I just kept forgetting that I was actually a host in this. So that's why we have each other, I guess.
I got you.
While Eran was talking, I was kind of thinking about how this would sound to someone who is very external from this society, someone who's been watching this for the past few years. And then even though Eran and the two of us all the time say, we're not excusing any of this, we're not saying that any of this is okay, but I imagine that it would feel really hard to hear, and it would feel like normalizing and excusing, even if that's not the intention. And I'm not quite sure how to communicate about these things in a way that doesn't feel like that.
That's one of the most difficult things to do. Like for me, when people talk about, oh, you're normalizing, this is normalizing the occupation, and I'm like, well, like where I live, I am part of a society where The military control and the oppression, the subjugation, the incarceration, the killing is normal. It's not talked about. So we actually, need to make sure it is not normalized. I think what people, mistake is between whitewashing, the Israeli state and the Israeli government's, policies over the decades, and talking about the Israeli society as redeemable. And I think people see that as whitewashing. I am kind of, insisting the ability of the Israeli society to change. Societies are not inherently, immoral.
I think like a comment that I remember the Standing Together page would get a lot was, which I really don't want people perceiving this as coming from something I would say, but a comment that we would get a lot was people saying, imagine you were saying these things about Germans during the Holocaust. Like, you wouldn't say these things about Germans during the Holocaust. You wouldn't extend as much grace, even if you were part of German society. And I always wonder, because people always say, well, you wouldn't say that about Germans during the Holocaust. You wouldn't say that about white South Africans during apartheid. So why are we sort of explaining the psychology of Jewish Israeli society? Obviously we're part of the society. I am very deeply within the society. I can understand on like a personal and cognitive level, like what the psyche of Jewish Israelis is. And yet still I do have that in my head saying, but you wouldn't necessarily extend that to a different society that was perpetrating atrocities. And I'm not sure if that's right or if our approach is right.
I don't think we're extending anything. I literally, I'm not extending these explanations in order to, to be more forgiving or
Right.
more, understanding. Like, I will never understand. I will never, be able to sympathize with that kind of reaction and those kind of stances. Never. But I also understand that in order for them to change, I need to understand why they exist.
Right.
Yeah. If you're not trying to understand the society you're trying to change, you're not serious about change.
It's a good quote. I like that.
I do think it was, what Iran had, like the specific example of pulling, a 30% that would, when it's framed as, a Palestinian state versus when it's like a regional framework that does include a Palestinian state. And you would have like a huge difference, almost, triple the amount of people that would support that. We heard about the poll that Iran mentioned, and I think that is a very important perspective on how we talk to people. It demonstrates in many ways almost like how slippery our work can be of, really staying, with the hand on our pulse of Israeli society and like understanding where they are and then trying to understand like what works best.
I think something that I thought was interesting that Eran spoke about when you asked about cognitive dissonance, like if people are living in this cognitive dissonance, and he was like, I don't even think that there's a dissonance there. I think that...
He surprised me with that answer.
Yeah.
I was like, sure, he's going to tell me there's dissonance. I struggle with that. I really struggle with that. Like, I went through a lot of clashes lately. I literally had like one woman like who's a deputy mayor, and like I was like, I don't want you to even feel my pain over like, can't you like not even at least understand it? Like understand. I literally was trying to like rationalize with her, which was very unlike me to do. And she's like, she kept going to like, my Chatufim. I'm like, yeah, like, absolutely. I want the Chatufim to come back, like the hostages to come back. Like, but like, how does that negate? By the way, her daughter was in Gaza and she kept mentioning that to me. And I'm like, that's exactly why you should be out to finish the war. So your daughter won't be in Gaza. And she like doesn't even she didn't even comprehend that. But I think what Iran made it very clear for me is that like line, that very, very hard line when the collective is traumatized, it's like you cannot compute. It's like one or the other. Like, what are you talking about? Like, why are you talking about the other? Like, this, like, my machatofim. And I think that made it much clearer to me that that line is like very real psychologically. It's a very real psychological barrier.
Yeah.
And
that protects you from dissonance almost.
That's it. Like, there's a, like, what are you talking about? Like, that's the other, you know? I guess that's where we have to come back and talk about, like, okay, so, like, how do we create that shared protagonist, like, shared collective? That's the only way to overcome that barrier. Like, we will never be able to overcome that barrier if we don't talk about, like, a joint movement.
Completely. And that's why I think what Eran said about being disruptive and constructive at the same time, I think is so important. And I think it is actually just what drives a lot of our messaging and a lot of what our work is. Because we're within the society. I think that's just the truth at the end of the day, is because we're fighting for the future of this place from within this society. What's interesting about your story is that, you know, Eran was saying that we need to be disruptive and constructive at the same time. And what you were trying to do in that story is you were being quite constructive. You were saying, yeah, I don't want your daughter to be there in Gaza, and I don't want the hostages to be killed, and I want them to come back. And so you were actually presenting quite coherent options while also being a sort of disruptive force in that space. Why do you think even that didn't compute?
I don't think, I mean, it's not like a secret solution and once you create it and like it's perfect and like, boop, here's a pill and boom, you know, the perfect dose of disruption and construction and you're cured, you know, and you're an ally. I don't think it works like that, obviously. I think people need to experience over months and years, you know, different kind of culture and institutions and messaging and people and politics and, you know, in order to understand it. It's a big mission. And I don't think it's in one conversation, obviously. I think it depends on so many different people, you know, leading so many communities and trying to talk to so many people for so long in order to do it. Change is not easy. Uri Weltman, one of our founders and, you know, a national leader and organizer within the movement, he always says, you know, the Israeli public is stuck in a restaurant with a menu that has one item. That's it. The item is military operation, military control, military reaction, military bombing, military, you know, everything. You have to choose it. Anyone that comes, you get hungry, you have to choose it. You every time you like, and you're stuck in that restaurant with that menu. And Iran talked about the fact that, you know, really the Israeli public doesn't have an alternative that does give them the sense of safety. I do agree with him. Like, he did talk about, like, it's our fault, you know, that we didn't do it. I don't know how individuals can really create an alternative for people. I think movements create alternatives for people.
I think that's what he means by our fault. Like,
yeah,
all of these organizations.
I do think the left has failed to create a movement that provides a real alternative to people. In the last 30 years, at least. I do think Rabin was able to provide, with all the criticism that I think people will have about, you know, the Oslo Accords and for Israelis, for the Israeli public, it was a very, very real option where, like, peace was security. That was our future, peace. It was there. You had songs about it. Literally, like, there were songs about peace. There were, like, everything.
Unthinkable.
It was
today.
pop culture. Like, peace was pop culture. Like, and obviously, like, I'm Palestinian and I remember that, you know, like, I remember it was cool. It was awesome. It was exciting. And I remember that like even lingered after, the assassination of Rabin, but then obviously it died, in the last 30 years. And that's what we need. And I think people would be critical of that. Like, no, like, fuck Oslo Accords. They were bad. They were bad for the Palestinians. It was conditional peace. It was really, really bad for the economy and the autonomy of Palestinians. It was definitely partial justice and partial equality and all of that. It was very, very problematic. But I think the biggest success of Oslo was creating
the alternative.
An alternative for the Israeli public and mobilizing the masses around peace. And I think we can only dream of such a movement now.
Someone actually sent a message to our email, which you can always do at podcast@standingtogether.org. Someone sent an email to us asking about hope, like how we have hope. And I think it really comes into all of this. Firstly, what Eran was saying about like more people identifying as sort of like activists or more people identifying with democratic values. I think there's a lot that like doesn't give me or us hope right now. I think I'm asking myself every day, when will people be able to grapple with what has happened in Gaza for the past 2 years? How long is that going to take? And as well as that, I think people are tired. I think the protest movement to get the hostages back was like relentless and strong for 2 years. And I think all the people that turned into activists and were mobilized are quite tired at this point. But that there is hope in this understanding that like we've seen this society capable of mobilizing around these societal interests. We've seen that people are capable of coming out to the streets, that the society is capable of really being politicized, that a lot of people who beforehand might have been like, I'm apolitical or I don't care about politics, are now talking about their political opinions all the time, even though some of those opinions are incredibly, incredibly scary. We have a place within which we can work. We actually have people who are capable of being mobilized and people who, to some extent, feel a bit done with the reality and ready for something new. As hard as it is for me right now to say that, like, I think it's not at all how I'm feeling, but I think that there is potential.
Yeah.
You just have to work really hard over many years.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Sally.
For listening to us and to Eran. Thank you to Eran, the aChord Center. Go check them out and see you next time.
See you next time. This show is produced by Yoshi Fields and music is from Epidemic Sound. Please like and subscribe wherever you listen. And if you have a question for us, feel free to email us and we might even bring it into the show. Our email is podcast@standing-together.org. We've also put it in the show notes. We'd really love to hear from you. And if you'd like to support the podcast, feel free to donate to Standing Together. You can find the link in our show notes too.